Today we're going to be talking about the first movie to be featured on this channel. Up until now I've only been talking about books, but I've got plenty of other ideas for different kinds of media that I want to cover around the general subject here, which is things that aren't science fiction and fantasy being used to fuel the creation of things that are. And after some feedback from the viewers, thank you by the way for everybody who voted, I decided our first movie would be Traffic by Steven Soderbergh, released in the year 2000. And it is what's been described as a hyperlink movie. It's basically a film that has multiple intersecting plot lines, all of which are revolving around some central concern. And in this case, the central concern is the drug trade. And it was adapted with some liberty from a BBC TV production from some years previously. I did see that version some years ago, but I don't remember it as well as I should have. I plan on digging it back up and rewatching it as it's recently been remastered and reissued. And there's also a US TV miniseries of this particular version of the story. I haven't seen that one yet either, but for today, I'm concentrating on Soderbergh's film version. And the idea behind the film is that it twines together several plot lines that all revolve around the drug trade. In the UK version, it was about the heroin trade from Afghanistan to the UK. And in this movie, it's about the cocaine trade from Mexico to the United States. And so the first plot line involves Judge Wakefield, played by Michael Douglas, who has been appointed the new drug czar for the United States. He doesn't know that his own daughter, Carolyn, played by Erica Christensen, is in fact using drugs quite extensively, despite the fact that she's an A student. And she's able to disguise her drug use pretty well up to a point. But his wife, Barbara, played by Amy Irving, does know about what's going on, and she's been holding back for his sake, because the last thing they need is a scandal like this to destroy this new appointment to the Office of Drug Control. Second plot line involves two DEA agents, Ray Castro, played by Luis Guzman, and Montel Gordon, played by Don Cheadle. And they arrange a bust of a cocaine dealer, a man named Eduardo Ruiz, played by Miguel Ferrer. And what they really want, however, is Ruiz's contacts. And Ruiz is able to, with a great deal of reluctance, arrange an immunity deal in exchange for information about his boss. His boss is a man named Carlos Ayala, played by Stephen Bauer. And meanwhile, in Mexico, there are two state policemen, Javier Rodriguez, played by Benicio del Toro, and his partner, Manolo Sanchez, played by Jacob Vargas. And they bust a drug ship, and this, by the way, is the first scene in the film, only to have their success yanked immediately out of their hands by the Mexican equivalent of the drug czar position, a man named General Salazar, played by Tomas Milian. And they find in time that Salazar is actually corrupt. He's conspiring with one of the two major cartels, the better to help one bump the other off and facilitate trade for his own benefit. And so in time, Javier goes to the United States to trade on what he knows, with a great deal of conflict in his heart. Meanwhile, Ayala's wife Helen, who's played by Catherine Zeta-Jones, is struggling to keep things together on her end after her husband is arrested and is sent through the grinding gears of the criminal justice system. And she goes so far as to continue his business. In fact, she does so under the nose of his lawyer, Arnie Metzger, played by Dennis Quaid. And she even manages to hire a hitman, a guy named Frankie Flowers, played by Clifton Collins Jr., whom Javier entrapped for Salazar and was tortured for information about his employers. Her plan is to send him after the informant who is taking down her husband, the Miguel Ferrer character. And so out of these different plot strands, different themes begin to grow. With Wakefield's plot strand, the Michael Douglas character, there's a growing unease on his part about whether or not he can actually do his job, especially with knowing what he knows about his family, whether he can execute all of this with a clear head and a conscience, especially as he begins to see that the realities of drug use exist on a very different level from all the platitudes that he himself has been offering about them and that he's been fed about them in his career. There's Ray and Monty, who dislike Eduardo intensely, and they maintain the value of the work that they do in the face of Eduardo's nihilism. Eduardo is convinced that all of their work is worthless because drugs are going to get imported into the US and sold one way or another. So why bother trying to stop them? And then there's Helen, discovering that she has ruthlessness and dark strength of her own that she didn't even know about. And she not only picks up where her husband left off, but she goes even further. And then there's Javier, who's feeling very much like a traitor for trying to do the right thing, and do some semblance of the right thing. And he has to do wrong by somebody in order to do it. Now, on the basic artistic and entertainment levels, this is a terrific movie. It's tremendously watchable. It's always in motion. It's tremendously propulsive. The movie won an Oscar for Best Editing for a good reason. But what I like about it, and what I'm going to focus on as my first entry point for the discussion here, is how it uses a multifaceted view of one particular subject, in this case the drug trade, and how these multifaceted views are expressed through each of the characters. The work as a whole has a specific point of view. It has a skeptical point of view with regard to whether or not the war on drugs accomplishes anything. But how that skepticism has all these different faces is embodied through literal faces, different people. So think for a minute about how we would have a science fiction work. I'm going to use science fiction for the sake of this discussion, but some of what I say could map to a fantasy story too. Imagine you have a science fiction work about some big normative event or invention or discovery, some big world-changing thing, aliens landing, or you have a device that allows direct mind-to-mind transition. Now, when something like this happens, one of the things that you can almost certainly expect is far more dissent and friction and difference of opinion over the thing in question than you can unified action. And so if you have specific characters in your story who can embody those different facets or aspects of the friction over this thing, people who are living out its implications, that's going to be a lot easier for an audience to connect to and empathize with and enjoy watching unfold than to simply have people sitting around talking about this stuff. And there is, in this movie, a certain amount of people sitting around and talking about the implications of things, but the vast majority of the time, they're living it out. It's playing out in concrete terms. Like one of the few scenes where there is like a little bit of speechifying, it's actually one of the best scenes in the movie because it springs directly out of one of the characters' own bits of ignorance. There's a scene where Wakefield goes and grabs one of his daughter's friends out of school and takes him on a quote-unquote field trip to find out where his daughter is. And he finds her in a drug den, and he says, "I can't believe you brought my daughter to a place like this." And the friend just sort of uncorks on him this whole speech about how if people were coming around to his neighborhood asking where they could get drugs, within days, everybody within his Tony upscale neighborhood would be selling drugs too. And in a case like that, why would you ever bother going to law school? And then there's a shot of Wakefield's response to this where you can see in his face that he's known about this in an intellectual way, but it has never really sunk in. And now that it's beginning to sink in a bit, he has to take it more seriously than it just being a speech. So another way that this works in the story, another way that you have this kind of faceting, this embodying through these different people, everyone in the story exists at a different level of the conflict, and they have different exposures to it. This is something that apparently is expanded on even further in the original BBC series because they had much more running time to do it in. So you have some people who have far more agency than others within the goings-on, some people who are relatively victimized, and some people who have that much more power. I should note that agency and power are not interchangeable. They have significant differences. Somebody with a lot of agency may have a lot of liberty to do things on their own, but that doesn't mean they necessarily are able to affect others. So to that end, some of the people in question have perspectives that are simply impossible for the others to share, at least as first. So in a science fiction story, it would be something like the difference between someone who's a working scientist, embroiled in whatever the controversy is, versus a politician. So we might have scientists who are studying this phenomenon and they have a much more functional understanding of it, but they have relatively little power in setting policy. They may be able to get up in front of Congress and tell them what they know, but that doesn't mean anything they say is going to be taken seriously. And then you might have people who don't necessarily know very much about it or have direct exposure to it. People like celebrities or thought leaders. I hate that phrase. People who far more readily shape public reaction and public behavior, whether or not they do so out of any real expertise, just because people know them. So when we think about, say, the aliens or this mind transfer device, as opposed to whatever policy is getting passed about those things, whatever practical effects they have in our lives, it's going to be very different. And the drug controversy in the film exists in the same way. There are the people who go out and use drugs and just say to themselves, hey, this is a fact of life, as opposed to people further up the food chain who are saying, we have to send a message to these drug dealers, and then don't realize that by doing so, they're not really making any changes to the day-to-day lived reality that these people have. So that got me thinking also about how, there's been more than one science fiction story that revolves around the notion that when some big thing happens that we think will change the world, it doesn't. It just ends up getting absorbed into our existing way of life. It ends up getting co-opted by it. And by the converse of that is you have stories that are about something that don't seem like they would be big deals, but they end up changing everything anyway. Look at how our lives have been totally changed by the way that some Swiss research institute needed a better computer-based documentation system. Enter the World Wide Web. That's how that all got started. So another facet of all of this is the fact of the multifacetedness of it, the interconnectedness of it. And this is a very postmodern storytelling kind of idea, that you have these different strands that all touch each other in one way or another. There's a lot of recent stories that trade on this idea in one form. The movie and book Cloud Atlas, for instance, gets brought up as one example of this, of these things that are touching across time. But you don't have to force connections between those things. You can just let the fact that they all revolve around the same central subject be enough. They're sharing a universe. That should generally do the trick. In Traffic, it's the universe around the drug trade. In your story, it could be the very fact that some great invention has transformed everything. Our world has become its world. That can often be enough to get things going. As a final note, I have seen quite a number of other movies that have been designed in this vein, what again called hyperlink movies. But when I went back over them, I kept saying to myself, Traffic really for me stands out as one of the best realized and also one of the most durable of the bunch. And a lot has changed in the 24 years since it was filmed, 25 years actually, especially in terms of our attitudes towards drugs as a society. The way we regard marijuana, for instance, has softened considerably. But there's still so much about it that holds up apart from that message. The storytelling construction. And again, the feeling of people trying to do the right thing in the face of indifference or hostility or futility, that's a pretty universal theme. I don't think that's going to age out. Also, the soundtrack. The soundtrack in this film is very subtle and understated. It was created by Cliff Martinez. And it is one of the few pieces of music that I can listen to consistently when I'm actually writing, because it is so in the background and so quiet, and yet at the same time so beautifully put together. So I think from all of this, there's a big lesson to be gleaned about how to create something that looks at all of the different ways that some big thing underpins the construction of your world. And you're going to do that through characters, and you're going to do that through characters who are necessarily on different sides of whatever it is that's going on. They're going to be sharing different parts of it. They're going to want different things out of it. They're going to see it in different ways. And a lot of those things are going to be things that are just a product of the fact that they are different people with different backgrounds and different lives and different ambitions and different intentions. It's unavoidable. So you might as well make that into the substance of the story. So once again, Traffic is available on Blu-ray from the Criterion Collection. I highly recommend their edition of it, as it has quite a bit of extra material. I think it's also the only edition of it that's now available in print in the United States. I hope you get as much out of it as I did. I know I got a lot out of it. And with that, I will see you around.